Don't forget to give a thumbs up and provide a comment, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content. So for this week's project, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to be making a platter, but this is the start of it here. It's a segmented platter with different stripes of wood. Hopefully you can see that. Circle drawn out here on it. That's going to be the size. It's going to be 12 inches around, so it's a good sized platter. But I'm going to use epoxy for this project. It's the first time that I've done a video with epoxy. It's actually I've only done epoxy before with pins. It'll be my first time with a bowl, or in this case a platter. But you'll see what I do with that in a minute. But we'll get started with it. I'm going to cut it out on the bandsaw to this circle pattern, just so it's a little bit easier to get started on the lathe. There's not going to be a lot of work to do with this. It's fairly thin to start with, so I'm not going to have to do a lot to it as far as turning goes. But once I get it turned around, then you'll see the next step in the process. So here it is, cut out round. So now that it's round, I'm going to put it on the lathe. I did remember that I forgot to mention, I did say that I was doing this platter. A good friend of mine, Darrell, who's a talented woodworker in his own right. Darrell does a lot of general carpentry and does some fine work himself. He had these scraps. He does some cutting boards. He has these scraps, and he made this up for me and gave it to me. And like I say, I'm going to turn it into a platter. I mentioned earlier I wasn't sure how I was going to mount this on the lathe. I've decided I'm going to use a worm screw after all. But the worm screw doesn't have to go the full depth, and I only want to go about halfway down the depth of this bowl so that I don't make a hole that goes all the way through. So I'm going to just go ahead and mark that with some tape so we'll know how deep to go with the drill bit, which is right there. So once I drill down, I'll know that that's my final depth. Double check. Yeah, that's good. So I'll go ahead and drill this hole, and then we'll mount the platter in the lathe with the worm screw. Here we go. We have a hole in the middle. And I'll mount that on the worm screw and put that on the lathe, and then I can turn a recess on the bottom so that I can mount it in my chuck. And so this is a worm screw. Basically, oops, sorry about that. It's just a reverse thread, so that you can put this on here in your lathe and screw your work up against the chuck. But it's a reverse thread. Otherwise, if it was a normal thread, when you were turning, the tool would just spin it off. So in this case, it's reversed so that it doesn't do that. So I've not going to be a whole lot of shaping to this. I'll put a little convex on the bottom. Just get a nice taper here on the side. Now that it's starting to get rounded, I'm not coming straight across the end grain. It's cutting much better. You can see the shavings are coming off pretty good size. So I'll finish shaping that, put a little foot down here at the bottom, and then we'll flip it over and finish the inside. So I do have to be a little careful here. As you remember, I put a worm screw in on this side. So I do not want to go too deep on this recess that I expose the worm screw. But I am going to turn the bottom to leave this recess on again so I can mount it the other way in my chuck. But before I do that, I'm going to completely finish this side of it before I flip it over. So I've sanded this to 600 grit and I've burnished it, cleaned it up with denatured alcohol. I think the bottom is pretty well finished. I think you can see it there in the camera, but it's got quite a bit of gloss already and there's no finish on it. So I'm pretty pleased with that. So you can see, I've turned it around and working on the inside. You can see that it's cutting well. Probably 15 minutes will be all that it takes to get the inside to the rough shape. I'll still have some sanding and fine tuning and scraping to do, but with my ball gouge I can hollow the inside of this out fairly quickly, and it gives a fairly smooth cut. Like I say, the shavings are nice and big. That's what you want to see as opposed to sawdust. It can be a long time hollowing out the inside of a bowl with these as opposed to these. That's as far as I'm going to go for now. I've sanded it up to 240, and we're going to take it off the lathe and we're going to do some more work on it. There's some resin embellishment work on this, and so stay tuned for that. So for the next part of the platter, I went out in the woods and I gathered a bunch of sticks. I've cut them just roughly, just into straight sections. I'm going to clean them up a little bit more. I removed the little branches off them, but I got a few different kinds. I got some young branches with still some bark on it that I was going to say it was alive, but I'm not so sure it was. And some that definitely weren't alive, more like driftwood. This was on a down tree. So I got some birch. So I got a variety of wood. Like I say, different species, different degrees of solidness, and also different diameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut these into a little bit shorter yet and clean up all the branches off of them, and then I'll get them ready for the next step. So here's my pile of sticks. I think I've got enough now for what I want to do. So I just, like I said, cut them to shorter length. I took a wire brush and just knocked off any of the, or most of the growth on the sides of the branches. Knock that off. I don't want that. It's going to be loose, so I just took the wire brush to those. Some of them are pretty wet. I just went outside in the woods and picked them up off the ground, so some of them are pretty wet. So water and resin don't mix well. So I'm going to put them in the microwave and dry them out before I mix them with resin. So I've arranged the sticks that I want to put into the bowl. And I'm going to, because they're wet, I'm going to put them in the microwave. Epoxy and water do not mix well, so I put them in the microwave for 3 minutes and then let them cool, and then put them back in for another 3 minutes, let them cool, and do that a few times until I figure that they've dried out. Okay, live and learn. I put them in the microwave for 3 minutes, let it cool, put it in for another 3 minutes, and they actually started to burn a little bit. So I've thrown those away and started over, and this time I'll go for a shorter period of time. Try 2 minutes. So I've dried my branches in the microwave. I found out that 2 minutes was too long. Don't ask me how I knew that, but it was. So I dried them out. I used 1 minute at a time. So I dried them for a minute, let them cool, do it for another minute, let them cool. And I did that for about 5 cycles. So now I'm just getting ready, now that they're dry, I'm going to get ready to put the branches into the bowl. So all I do is just kind of arrange them in a random pattern. And then I'm just going to outline them. And they don't have to be a tight fit when they're in there because there will be resin around them. But I want it to look reasonably natural. So here's the platter with the shapes cut out. My wife was a little bit disappointed when she saw that I had gone and ruined a perfectly good platter with by cutting holes in it. But you'll see how this looks with the resin in it. I think she'll be happy in the end. Hopefully you'll like it as well. So I just, after I'd drawn the shapes on here, I then took my Forstner bits and drilled some holes. Unfortunately, I don't have a scroll saw, so I used a skill saw to cut them out. They were a little rough, but then I just used a Dremel and a sanding disc to clean up all the edges. So they're pretty smooth now, and we're ready to go ahead and start forming it up and put the resin and the branches in it. So the next step with the project is to start to form a mold where you can pour your resin into. So here you see I've got some coffee cups, some Tim Hortons cups, and I've cut them and attached them to the platter itself. The cups work well because they're waxed, which helps the resin preventing it from sticking. Once I get the molds poured, then I put the sticks in, just arranging them randomly, trying to fill the hole as much as possible, setting the sticks in, and again just filling all the holes as much as I can. Once that's done, I start to mix up the resin. For this, I just followed the directions on the resin. It was a slow set resin, which I ended up getting from Michael's. Michael's isn't the most cost-effective place to buy the resin, but if you watch for sales, it's not too bad, and you can get it in small volumes. The other thing I've done here is I've added some micro powder to the epoxy, because the epoxy is clear, so you'll see what I'm pouring there was blue. So I've gone ahead and poured that into the platter. Once the resin is set up overnight, the next step is to cut the branches off with a flush cut saw. You can also see on the bottom of the bowl the molds are still there. I hot glued those on just to prevent any leaks, and once that's done, then I'll proceed to take them off on the lathe. You'll also see here where I put on a mold around the edge so that I could pour resin in and build up the edge, which was also had branches in it. So we're all set to go. I'm starting to do the final sanding. The epoxy is all filled in. I did have a couple divots, one right here. You probably can't see that on camera. I know you can't because it's no longer there. and I also had a little bit right here that I had to fill in. So rather than, I did initially put a form on it, which you've seen in the video earlier, and poured the regular epoxy in. For these, they were very, very small. So what I did instead was just mixed up a little bit of 5-minute epoxy and put the colorant in it and let it set up a little bit so it was a little bit firmer so that I could fill the holes without a need to create a form. So I now have a surface that is smooth with the epoxy. Everything is filled in. So with the epoxy, they tend to show the scratches, so you have to sand it to a very high grit, so it's very smooth. But I'm going to do that now. I just finished with 80 grit, and move my way up to at least 1,000, and then we'll put the finish on after that. Sanding epoxy is different than sanding wood. The epoxy will tend to show scratches a lot more than the wood will. Like I'm sanded up to 400 grit. The wood is shiny and glossy, but I can still see scratches in the epoxy. So normally I could stop here with wood and it would be plenty fine enough, but the epoxy is definitely still showing some scratches. The other thing is I've got to clean it with a lot more with denatured alcohol. I don't want that fine sawdust to fill those scratches, so I've got to clean that off. Then you'll see it here in the epoxy. It'll look a little cloudy, and then when I clean it with denatured alcohol, it does clean it up. So I got to keep doing that and make sure as I sand in between the grits that I get rid of that sawdust, so that I'm not continuing just to drive that into the surface. I'm at 400 grit. I'm going to have to keep going. There's still some more areas to clean up here. Like anything when sanding, when you move to one grit from another, you shouldn't see any scratches from the previous grit. And then each time you do it, there'll be a little bit more or a little bit less scratches. So until eventually you don't see any. I've actually wet sanded it up to 3,000 grit. What you're looking for is scratches in the epoxy, because they'll show scratches much easier than the wood. And they look clean. I don't see anything there. So I then just wiped it down with denatured alcohol, which again just cleans the sawdust, any fine sanding dust off of it. And I'm going to apply a regular finish on the back, which will give it a bit of shine. And then I'm going to apply a food grade finish on the front, and then I'll buff the whole thing. And I'll come back when we're ready to buff it. So here's the finished product. It's my first time at using resin. I think it turned out pretty well. So here it's a charcuterie board with epoxy and branches, and finished with a food safe finish so that you can use it for a platter for cheese or any other foods you'd like. There's my logo in the bottom, which I just glued in. You can see that the epoxy is see-through, so you can see right through, and you can see the branches in it. So I think it turned out fairly well. I'm pretty pleased with it. It's got a nice shiny finish. And now on to the next project. Stay tuned. Be sure to subscribe so you can see what the next project is. So here's some final shots of the finished product. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you do, don't forget to give a thumbs up
and to subscribe. I really appreciate anyone that could leave a comment as well, give me some feedback, and thank you very much for watching.